They offered him more money than most men see in a lifetime, and he refused without a word. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. And if you believe in justice that rides silent, hit like and follow. Now, back to the story. The sun sat high over Dry Creek, burning through a thin veil of dust that never quite settled in that town. It clung to boots, to window frames, to the edges of every man's patience. On the main street, between the general store and the saloon, a small crowd had gathered, drawn not by noise, but by the kind of stillness that meant something was about to change. Ethan Cole stood at the center of it, hat low, shoulders relaxed, as if he had all the time in the world. In his hand was a folded contract, thick paper, sealed in red wax that had already begun to soften under the heat. Across from him stood Wallace Grady, a man whose smile never reached his eyes, his vest too clean for a place like this, his boots too polished to have walked far. In his hand, a leather pouch sagged with weight, the faint clink of coins inside carrying farther than any voice. "You sign," Wallace said, almost gentle, like he was offering a favor, "and that pouch is yours. No trouble, no questions." A few men in the crowd shifted, exchanging glances. They knew that tone. It wasn't a request. Behind Wallace, Sheriff Dunham leaned against a wooden post, one thumb hooked lazily near his belt, watching with the kind of interest a man shows when he already knows how things are supposed to end. And then there was the girl. She stood just off to the side, close enough to be part of the deal, far enough to be ignored if things went wrong. Ayanna Redbird. Her dress was simple, worn from travel, the color of desert clay after rain. Her hands rested calmly at her sides, fingers still, not clenched, not trembling. Around her neck hung a thin silver chain, catching the sunlight in brief flashes each time the wind stirred her dark hair. Most people didn't look at her twice. To them, she was part of the transaction. To Ethan, she was the only thing in that street that mattered. "It's good land," Wallace continued, tapping the contract lightly. "Water runs year-round. Fence lines already marked. All you gotta do is sign your name and walk away richer than you've ever been." Ethan didn't answer. He turned the paper slightly in his hand, as if weighing it. The wax seal glinted red. For a moment, it looked like dried blood in the sunlight, but no one said that out loud. A laugh broke from somewhere in the crowd. "Man'd be a fool not to take that," someone muttered. Another voice followed, quieter. "Maybe he already is." The wind shifted again, carrying the faint smell of leather, horses, and something older, something that didn't belong to the town at all. Ethan's eyes moved, not to the money, not to the sheriff, but to the small pendant resting against Ayanna's collarbone. A simple piece, silver wrapped around a stone the color of a clear sky just before dusk, worn smooth, like it had been held many times before. His fingers tightened slightly around the contract, just enough to crease the paper. Something flickered behind his eyes. Not fear, not doubt, recognition. Wallace noticed the hesitation and smiled wider. "That's it," he said softly. "Think it through. You walk away from this. You walk away with nothing. Sign it, and you're set for life." Sheriff Dunham straightened just a little, the wood creaking under his shift in weight. The crowd leaned in, not moving closer, but listening harder. Even the horses tied along the rail seemed to grow quiet, ears twitching toward the center of the street. Ayanna didn't move, didn't speak, but her gaze lifted, meeting Ethan's for the first time. There was no plea in her eyes, no fear, just a steady, quiet knowing, as if she had already seen this moment play out in a way no one else could understand. The chain around her neck caught the light again, and in that brief flash, something old and buried stirred in Ethan Cole's memory, something tied to a storm, to rushing water, to a promise made when no one was watching. The contract in his hand suddenly felt heavier than it should. The pouch of coins let out a soft, tempting clink as Wallace shifted his grip. The entire town held its breath without realizing it. And right there, in the heat and dust of Dry Creek, with gold on one side and silence on the other, Ethan Cole made a choice that no one present would understand, at least, not yet. The paper did not move in his hand, but everything else did. A loose shutter tapped somewhere down the street, slow and uneven. A horse stamped against the dirt, metal shoe striking stone with a dull ring that echoed farther than it should have. Ethan Cole stood where he was, but the world around him felt like it had shifted half an inch out of place. Wallace Grady watched him carefully now, the easy smile still there but thinner, stretched across something less certain. "You are taking too long," Wallace said, his voice still calm, but the softness had changed. "It is a simple choice." Sheriff Dunham's gaze flicked between them, measuring, waiting. The man had seen deals like this before. He knew how they ended. Or at least, he thought he did. Ethan lowered his eyes to the contract again. The ink lines were clean, precise, every word chosen to sound fair while meaning something else entirely. Land transfer. Full rights. No contest. It was all there, written in a way that made it seem like a favor instead of a taking. His thumb brushed the edge of the page, feeling the slight roughness where it had been cut. It reminded him of something. Not the paper itself, but the way it felt. The weight of it. The finality. A memory surfaced, quiet and unwelcome. Rain falling hard enough to blur the horizon. Water rising where it should not have. A figure on the far bank, steady while everything else moved. And a voice that had spoken without asking for anything in return. Ethan's jaw tightened, just a fraction. He lifted his head again. Wallace followed the movement, misreading it as hesitation, as the last moment before agreement. "You are not just buying land," Wallace continued, shifting the pouch in his hand so the coins chimed again, brighter this time. "You are buying freedom. No more scraping by. No more wondering if the next winter will take what little you have left. This ends all of that." A man near the edge of the crowd nodded slowly, as if the words made sense to him. Another folded his arms, watching Ethan like. He was already disappointed. The town had seen men choose money before. It was the only choice that ever made sense to them. Ayanna Redbird did not look at the pouch. She did not look at Wallace. Her attention stayed on Ethan, unbroken, steady as the horizon. The wind caught the ends of her hair again, lifting them just enough to reveal the pendant fully for the first time. The stone at its center held the light differently now, not just reflecting it, but softening it, turning it into something warmer, older. Ethan's breath slowed. He knew that stone, not by shape, not by color, but by the way it carried itself. Some things were made to be seen. Others were made to be recognized. Wallace took a step closer, closing the space just enough to press the moment forward. "All you have to do," he said, lowering his voice so it felt like a private conversation in the middle of a public street, "is sign. Everything else will take care of itself." Sheriff Dunham shifted again, the faint creak of leather cutting through the quiet. He was not intervening. He was not stopping anything. He was simply making sure nothing unexpected happened. That was his kind of law. Ethan glanced past Wallace for a brief second, toward the far end of the street where the road stretched out into open land. The dust there moved differently, slower. He could not say why he noticed it, only that he did. Then he looked back. The contract in his hand felt heavier than before, as if it carried more than ink and paper, as if it carried the weight of something that had already been decided long before he stepped into this town. Wallace extended the pouch slightly, offering it more directly now. The leather creaked under his grip. The coins inside shifted, their sound sharp and clean, like a promise that had never been broken. "Do not make this harder than it needs to be," Wallace said. "Men spend their whole lives waiting for a moment like this." Ethan's fingers loosened slightly on the paper. Not enough to drop it, just enough to let the air move between his hand and the contract. Ayanna's eyes did not change, but something in them deepened, as if she was not watching what he would do, but remembering. Something he had already done. The street held its breath again. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the wind seemed to pause, waiting for the sound of a pen against paper. And in that silence, the distance between gold and dust became something far greater than a few steps across a wooden street. The silence did not break all at once. It cracked slowly, like drywood under too much weight. Somewhere behind Ethan, a chair scraped against the porch of the saloon, the sound sharp and out of place. No one laughed this time. No one spoke. Wallace Grady kept his hand extended, the pouch of coins hanging between them, heavy, certain, undeniable. But his eyes had changed. The easy confidence was gone now, replaced by something tighter, something that watched instead of assumed. "You are making a mistake," Wallace said, and this time there was no softness left in his voice. It carried across the street, low and steady, meant for everyone to hear. "Out here, a man does not turn his back on opportunity." Ethan Cole did not answer. His fingers shifted again, and for a brief moment, the contract tilted in his hand, catching the sunlight along its edge. The red wax seal glowed, softened further by the heat, its shape beginning to blur. It looked less like a mark of authority now and more like something that could be erased. Sheriff Dunham pushed himself off the wooden post, boots landing firm in the dust. He did not step forward, not yet, but the movement alone was enough to tighten the air. "Mr. Cole," the sheriff said, voice even, careful, "you have been offered a fair arrangement. It would be wise to consider it properly." Wise. The word hung there, heavier than it should have been. Around them, the town watched with a kind of quiet hunger. Men who had taken less for more. Men who had never been offered anything at all. They looked at Ethan not with anger, but with something closer to confusion, as if they were trying to understand a language they had never learned. Ayanna Redbird shifted her weight slightly, no more than an inch, the fabric of her dress brushing softly against itself. The sound was small, almost lost in the open air, but Ethan heard it. His eyes moved to her. Again, the pendant rested still now, no longer flashing, the stone holding its color like a piece of sky that refused to fade. He remembered the rain more clearly this time. The way it had fallen in sheets, turning the ground to mud, the river to something wild and unrecognizable. He remembered reaching for something solid and finding nothing. And then, a hand. Not pulling, not forcing, just there. Steady, certain. A choice offered without words. The memory passed as quickly as it came, leaving behind a weight that settled somewhere deeper than thought. Wallace took another step, closing the distance fully now. The pouch was within easy reach. Close enough that Ethan could feel the presence of it without looking. "Last time," Wallace said, each word measured. "Take it. Sign. Walk away with more than you came here with." The coins shifted again, a soft, inviting sound. Sheriff Dunham's gaze narrowed just slightly, watching Ethan's hands, watching for the movement that would end this. The crowd leaned in, drawn by something they could not name. Even the horses had gone still now, heads lowered, ears turned toward the center of the street. Ethan lowered the contract by an inch. Not enough to drop it, just enough to break the line between himself and Wallace. The paper brushed against his leg, a faint, dry whisper. His other hand moved, slow and deliberate, not toward the pouch, not toward the pen, but toward his own belt, where nothing of value hung. It was an empty motion, and yet it carried meaning all the same. Wallace saw it. His jaw tightened, the first real crack in his composure. "Do not be foolish," he said, quieter now, but sharper. "You think walking away makes you better than the rest of us?" The question lingered, not meant to be answered, only to provoke. Ethan lifted his head, finally meeting Wallace's eyes directly. There was no challenge in his gaze. No anger. Just a calm that did not belong to this place. He said nothing. That was what unsettled them most. Not refusal. Not defiance. Silence. The kind that did not ask for permission. The kind that did not need to explain itself. Wallace's hand lowered a fraction, the pouch dipping with it. "Sheriff." Dunham's posture shifted again, uncertainty creeping into a stance that had been solid moments before. The town did not understand what they were seeing, but they felt it. Something had changed, and it was not in the contract, or the money, or the law standing behind it. It was in the man who refused to move the way they expected. And somewhere beyond the edge of Dry Creek, where the road met open land, the dust continued to rise in a slow, steady line, unnoticed by most, but not by all. The distance between them felt shorter now, even though no one had moved. Wallace Grady lowered the pouch just enough to rest against his leg, the coins inside settling with a muted, final sound, as if they too had begun to understand that something was slipping beyond his control. The smile he had worn since the beginning did not return. In its place came a stillness that was colder, more deliberate. "You think this ends here," Wallace said quietly, not to the crowd, not even to the sheriff, but to Ethan alone, as if the rest of the town had already faded from relevance. "You think walking away is the same as choosing something else?" Ethan Cole did not shift his stance. The contract remained in his hand, lowered now, no longer between them, but no longer part of the conversation either. The paper had become weight without purpose. His eyes did not leave Wallace, but his attention had already moved elsewhere, beyond the man, beyond the street, towards something that had not yet arrived, but was already being felt. Sheriff Dunham stepped forward this time, one measured step that pressed his boots deeper into the dust. The faint outline of his badge caught the sunlight, flashing briefly before settling into shadow again. "Let us keep things simple," the sheriff said, his tone steady but firmer than before. "There is no need to complicate a lawful agreement. Mr. Cole, you have been given a fair offer. It would be best for everyone if this matter concluded cleanly." Cleanly. The word hung heavier than the others. Around them, the crowd had grown quieter, not out of patience, but because something in the air had shifted in a way they could not name. The earlier curiosity had turned into something else. Unease. A feeling that they were no longer watching a transaction, but standing at the edge of something they did not understand. Ayanna Redbird took a slow breath, barely visible except for the slight rise and fall of her shoulders. The pendant at her neck rested against her skin, still, grounded, no longer catching the light in sharp flashes but holding it softly, as if it no longer needed to be seen to be known. Her gaze remained on Ethan, unwavering, not demanding anything, not asking for anything, simply present. Ethan's grip loosened further. The contract slipped another inch, the edge brushing against his thigh again with that same dry whisper. His thumb moved across the surface of the paper, not reading, not tracing words, but feeling the texture, the finality that it tried to carry. It did not hold the same weight anymore. Wallace noticed. His eyes narrowed slightly, calculating, adjusting. "You are not refusing me," he said, the calm returning in a different form now, sharper, more controlled. "You are refusing what this town stands on. Order, agreement, progress." The words were chosen carefully, meant to reach beyond Ethan, to pull the crowd back into alignment, to remind them of what they believed they were protecting. A few heads nodded again, slower this time, less certain. Sheriff Dunham shifted his weight, the leather of his belt creaking softly. "No one is asking you to betray anything," he added. "Just to accept what is already in front of you." Ethan's gaze moved then, not to the sheriff, not to Wallace, but to the space just beyond them, down the long stretch of road where the dust had continued to rise. It was clearer now. Not a storm, not wind. A line. Slow, steady, intentional. He said nothing. That silence pressed harder than any argument could have. Wallace followed his gaze for a brief moment, then dismissed it, bringing the focus back where he wanted it. "Look at me," Wallace said, sharper now, the command slipping through before he could soften it. Ethan did not obey immediately. When he did, it was not in response to the command, but because he had already seen what he needed to see. His eyes returned to Wallace. Calm, steady, carrying something that did not belong to this negotiation. Wallace took one final step forward, closing the last inch between them. The pouch lifted again, offered not as temptation now, but as a test. "Take it," he said. 2 words. No decoration, no persuasion, just expectation. The street held still. No wind, no movement. Even the distant sound that had been building along the horizon seemed to pause, as if waiting for the same answer. Ethan's hand moved. Slow, deliberate, not toward the pouch, not toward the pen. He lifted the contract just enough to look at it one last time. The red seal had softened completely now, its shape blurred beyond recognition. Whatever authority it once carried had melted under the same sun that now watched them all. Then, without a word, his fingers opened. The paper slipped free. It fell through the space between them, turning once in the air before landing in the dust at Wallace's feet. The sound was almost nothing, but it carried farther than any coin ever could. The paper settled into the dust without ceremony, its edges curling slightly as the heat pressed down on it, the red wax now nothing more than a smudge against the ground. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The sound that followed was not loud, but it carried weight. A single breath released somewhere in the crowd, then another, until the silence shifted into something heavier, thicker, like air before a storm that no one had seen coming. Wallace Grady did not look at the contract at his feet. His eyes stayed fixed on Ethan Cole, searching for something that might explain what had just happened, something that could be corrected, reversed, undone. But there was nothing there to take hold of. No hesitation, no regret, just that same quiet stillness that had begun to unsettle the entire street. "You dropped it," Wallace said finally, his voice controlled, precise, as if naming the act would somehow change its meaning. Ethan did not respond. He had already begun to turn, slow and deliberate, the movement unhurried, as though he were stepping away from something that had never belonged to him in the first place. The shift drew every eye with it. Boots remained planted, but attention followed him like a shadow stretching across the street. Sheriff Dunham's hand hovered closer to his belt now, not reaching, not drawing, just resting in a place that suggested he was reconsidering something he thought he understood. "Mr. Cole," the sheriff called, not loud, but firm enough to carry. "You have not concluded this matter." The words lingered in the air, but they did not land. Ethan continued his turn until his back faced Wallace fully. The gesture was simple, final. It carried no defiance, no challenge, just an absence of participation. Wallace's jaw tightened. The pouch in his hand shifted as his grip adjusted, the coins inside clinking once, sharply, as if reminding him of their presence, their value, their certainty. "You think you can walk away?" Wallace said, the calm cracking now, something harder pushing through beneath it. "You think this town will just forget what you have refused?" The crowd shifted again, but not in agreement, not in support. Something had changed in the way they stood, in the way they watched. The earlier certainty had faded, replaced by a quiet that did not belong to Wallace anymore. It did not belong to the sheriff either. It belonged to the space Ethan had just created by letting go. Ayanna Redbird's hand rose slowly, not hurried, not uncertain. Her fingers touched the pendant at her neck, resting there for a moment, as if confirming something only she could feel. The silver chain moved slightly against her skin, catching a softer light now, less about reflection, more about presence. She did not step forward. She did not speak, but her posture changed in a way that only a few noticed. Not larger, not louder, just grounded. Ethan took his first step away from the center of the street. The sound of his boot against the dirt was quiet, but it carried farther than the coins had, farther than Wallace's voice, farther than the sheriff's authority. It was a sound that did not ask permission. It did not wait for approval. It simply moved forward. Another step followed. The distance between him and the contract widened. The distance between him and the pouch of gold widened. But something else closed. The space between him and the road beyond the town. The dust at the far end of the street had risen higher now, no longer a faint line but a presence, steady and approaching. A few heads turned toward it, not fully, not yet, but enough to notice that the horizon was no longer empty. Wallace saw it this time. Just a glance. Just enough for the smallest flicker of uncertainty to pass through his expression before he forced it away. "This is not over," he said, louder now, trying to pull the moment back under his control, to anchor it in something familiar. But the words did not carry the same weight. They did not settle the same way. Ethan did not stop. He did not turn. He did not acknowledge the statement at all. His pace remained even, unhurried, as though the outcome had been decided long before he ever stepped into Dry Creek. Sheriff Dunham watched him go, the lines in his face tightening slightly, not from anger, but from the realization that something had slipped beyond the reach of his badge, beyond the reach of the simple order he had relied on. The contract lay in the dust between them all, ignored now, its purpose undone by a single decision. The pouch of gold remained in Wallace's hand, heavy, real, and suddenly without direction. And the town, which had gathered to watch a man choose wealth, found itself watching something else entirely, something it did not yet understand but could no longer dismiss. Out beyond the edge of Dry Creek, the rising dust continued its slow approach, and for the first time, more than one person began to wonder what exactly Ethan Cole had chosen to walk toward instead. The sound reached them before the sight did. Not loud, not urgent, just a steady rhythm that did not belong to the town. Hoofbeats, distant but deliberate, carrying across the open land in a way that made the air feel tighter with each passing second. Ethan Cole did not slow. His steps remained even, measured, as if he had already counted the distance ahead and found nothing there worth hurrying for. Behind him, the town began to shift, not in movement, but in attention. Heads turned more fully now, eyes drawn toward the far edge of Dry Creek where the rising dust had taken shape into something more defined. Wallace Grady stood where he was, the pouch still in his hand, but it no longer hung with the same certainty. The weight of it had changed, not in gold, but in meaning. He followed the direction of the other's gaze this time, not dismissing it, not ignoring it, but studying it with a growing tension that settled into his shoulders. "Just riders," he said, though no one had asked. The words were meant to steady the moment, to bring it back to something simple, something controlled. But they did not land that way. Sheriff Dunham turned his head slowly, his posture tightening in a way that had nothing to do with authority and everything to do with recognition. He had heard that rhythm before. Not often, not close. The horses tied along the rail shifted again, more restless now, hooves scraping, reins pulling taut as they sensed something approaching that did not follow the patterns they knew. The wind carried a different scent with it, faint but distinct, cutting through dust and leather with something older, something that did not belong to the town or the deals made within it. Ayanna Redbird lowered her hand from the pendant, her fingers releasing the chain without hurry. Her gaze moved for the first time away from Ethan, lifting toward the horizon where the dust rose in a steady line. There was no surprise in her expression, no concern, only a quiet acknowledgement, as if something expected had finally chosen to arrive. Ethan reached the edge of the gathered crowd, the line where watchers became space. A man stepped aside without being asked, then another, the path opening not out of respect, but out of something they could not name. He did not look at them. He did not thank them. He simply moved through, each step carrying him farther from the center of the street and closer to the open road beyond. Behind him, Wallace took a step forward, then stopped, the motion unfinished, caught between impulse and uncertainty. "This does not change anything," he said, louder now, trying to reclaim the moment, to pull it back under his voice. But the words felt thinner, stretched against something larger that was no longer listening. The dust at the far end of the road broke its shape, separating into forms, into movement that could no longer be mistaken for wind. Riders, not scattered, not hurried, a line, evenly spaced, their silhouettes cutting through the haze with a precision that made the town fall quieter with each passing second. Sheriff Dunham's hand lowered from his belt, not out of ease, but out of calculation. He watched the approach with narrowed eyes, measuring distance, counting shapes, searching for intent in the way they moved. "Stay where you are," he muttered, though it was unclear who the words were meant for. The crowd did not respond. They were already still, already watching. Ethan stepped onto the open stretch of road, the packed dirt giving way slightly under his boots. The space ahead of him felt wider than the town behind him, quieter, as if it had been waiting for him to step into it. He did not stop. He did not turn. The rhythm of the hoofbeats grew clearer now, each impact distinct, steady, controlled. Not a rush, not a charge, something else, something that carried intention without urgency. Ayanna took a single step forward, just enough to move out of the shadow she had been standing in. The light caught her face more fully now, revealing a calm that did not match the tension spreading through the town. The pendant at her neck rested still, no longer moving, no longer needing to draw attention. Wallace's grip tightened around the pouch again, the leather creaking under the pressure. He watched Ethan's back, then the approaching riders, then the contract lying forgotten in the dust. For the first time since he had arrived in Dry Creek, he did not seem certain which of those things mattered most. The riders drew closer, their forms sharpening against the horizon, details beginning to emerge through the thinning veil of dust. The town held its breath again, not out of anticipation this time, but out of something quieter, heavier. Understanding had not arrived yet, but it was close. And Ethan Cole, walking away from everything they believed held value, did not look back as it came. The riders did not slow as they came into full view, and that was the first thing that unsettled the town. They did not rush either. Their pace held steady, measured in long, even strides that carried across the last stretch of open land with quiet certainty. There were more of them than anyone had first guessed. Not dozens, not a scattered group. A line that extended farther than the eye could follow at a glance. Each rider spaced with intention, each movement aligned with the one beside it. No shouting, no raised weapons, just presence. Ethan Cole stepped forward along the road without breaking stride, the distance between him and the approaching line closing with every breath. The dust around their horses lifted and settled in slow waves, catching the light in a way that made the entire horizon seem to move. Behind him, Dry Creek had gone completely still. Wallace Grady no longer spoke. The pouch of gold remained in his hand, but it hung lower now, forgotten for moments at a time before his grip tightened again, as if to remind himself it was still there. Sheriff Dunham had moved 2 steps into the street without realizing it, his attention fixed on the riders with a focus that had nothing to do with authority and everything to do with caution. The badge on his chest caught the sunlight again, but it no longer carried the same weight it had minutes before. Ayanna Redbird stood where she had been, but the space around her felt different now, as if the ground itself had settled beneath her feet. Her gaze followed the approaching line, calm, unhurried, her expression unchanged. The pendant at her neck rested against her skin, unmoving, no longer needing to catch the light to be seen. The first rider reached the edge of the town without breaking pace. His horse stepped onto the packed dirt of the street with a soft, deliberate sound, the kind that carried without force. He did not look left or right. He did not acknowledge the crowd. His eyes moved forward, past the buildings, past the people, settling on the figure walking toward him from the opposite direction. Ethan did not stop. The distance between them closed to 20 yards, then 15, then 10. The rider slowed his horse, not in reaction, but in recognition, as if the timing had always been set this way. Behind him, the line adjusted in perfect silence, each rider easing their pace in unison until the entire formation came to a gradual, controlled halt. The dust settled around them, drifting downward until the air cleared enough to reveal details that had been hidden moments before. Leather worn smooth by years of use. Beads and patterns worked into clothing with care and meaning. Faces steady, eyes sharp, not searching for conflict, but aware of everything. Sheriff Dunham exhaled slowly, a breath he had not realized he was holding. Wallace took a half step back, then stopped himself, the motion small but visible. The crowd did not move at all. They simply watched, as if afraid that any motion might break whatever balance had formed in the center of the street. Ethan came to a stop 3 paces from the first rider. For the first time since he had turned away from the contract, he paused. The 2 men faced each other in silence, the space between them carrying more weight than the entire town behind them. The rider inclined his head, just slightly, the gesture controlled, deliberate. Not submission, not challenge, recognition. Ethan answered with the smallest movement of his own, a nod that held the same quiet meaning. No words passed between them. None were needed. Behind the first rider, others began to dismount, one by one, their movements smooth, practiced, each action taken without hurry, without sound beyond the soft thud of boots meeting dirt. They did not spread out. They did not surround anything. They simply stood, forming a presence that reshaped the space around them without force. Ayanna stepped forward then, leaving the place where she had stood for so long. The crowd parted again without being asked, the same unspoken motion that had opened for Ethan now opening for her. She moved with the same steady pace, crossing the distance between herself and the riders without looking back, without hesitation. When she reached the edge of their line, she stopped. For a brief moment, she stood between 2 worlds, the town behind her, the riders before her. Then she lifted her hand to the pendant at her neck and drew it forward, letting the stone catch the light fully. The first rider's gaze shifted to it, then back to her face. The smallest change passed through his expression, something that might have been acknowledgement, might have been something deeper. He stepped aside, just enough to create space. Ayanna moved through. The line opened for her without a word, without a signal, each rider shifting just enough to let her pass, then settling back into place. Wallace watched this with growing disbelief, the meaning of the moment slipping further from his grasp with each silent exchange. The gold in his hand had never felt less certain. And Ethan Cole, standing at the center of it all, said nothing, because everything that needed to be understood had already begun to reveal itself without a single word spoken. The town did not understand what it was seeing, but it felt it. Not in words, not in reason, in the way the air had changed, in the way no one dared to move first. Ayanna Redbird walked through the line of riders as if she had always belonged there, her steps steady, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze forward. No one stopped her. No one questioned her. The men who had arrived with the dust parted without hesitation, each small shift of their bodies silent but deliberate, as though her presence carried a meaning older than any agreement made in Dry Creek. When she reached the center of their formation, she stopped. The pendant in her hand caught the sunlight again, but this time it did not flicker. It held the light, steady, unwavering. The first rider stepped forward, just one pace, his eyes fixed on the stone, then lifting to her face. He placed his hand over his chest, not fast, not forced, but with a quiet certainty that did not need to be explained. One by one, the others followed. No command was given. No voice called out. And yet the motion moved through them like a single thought. Hands rose. Heads inclined. A gesture repeated down the line until it reached the last rider still standing at the edge of the dust. Sheriff Dunham's breath caught, barely audible, but enough to break the stillness around him. He had seen respect before. He had seen fear. This was neither. This was something else. Something that did not ask permission from badges or contracts or the weight of gold in a man's hand. Wallace Grady did not move at all. The pouch of coins hung forgotten at his side, his fingers no longer tightening around it, no longer reminding himself of its worth. His eyes moved from the riders to Ayanna, then to Ethan Cole, standing just beyond them, untouched by the shift that had overtaken the town, and for the first time since he had stepped into Dry Creek, Wallace looked uncertain. Not about the deal, not about the money, about the ground beneath his own feet. Ethan watched it all without stepping closer, without claiming anything, without saying a word. The distance he had created by letting go of the contract remained, but it no longer felt like distance. It felt like clarity, the kind that only came when something false had been removed and nothing rushed to replace it. Ayanna lowered her hand slowly, the pendant resting once more against her collarbone. The gesture rippled through the riders again, their hands returning to their sides, their posture settling back into stillness, but not the same stillness as before. This one held acknowledgement. Completion. The first rider turned his gaze to Ethan then, holding it for a moment that stretched just long enough to carry meaning without sound. There was no challenge in it. No question. Only a recognition that passed between them like something already understood. He inclined his head again, slightly deeper this time, then stepped back into place. The line reformed without effort, without signal, as though it had never been broken at all. The town remained silent. No one spoke. No one dared to interpret what they had just witnessed. The contract lay in the dust behind them, forgotten. The pouch of gold remained in Wallace's hand, untouched, and yet neither seemed to matter anymore. The measure of value had shifted in a way no one could explain, only feel. Ethan turned his head just enough to glance back toward the street. Not at Wallace. Not at the sheriff. At the space where the contract had fallen. For a brief moment, his eyes rested there. Then he looked away again. The first rider lifted his hand slightly, a small motion, almost nothing, but enough. The line responded. Horses shifted. Reins were gathered. Without urgency, without noise, the riders began to turn, their formation bending as one, preparing to leave the way they had come. Ayanna did not look back at the town. She stepped into the space they opened for her, her place among them as natural as if it had never been in question. Wallace took a step forward then, sudden, uncertain, as if the moment had finally caught up to him. But he stopped almost immediately, the motion incomplete, his voice never forming the words he might have tried to say. There was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to claim. The dust began to rise again as the riders moved, slow at first, then steady, carrying with them the quiet weight of something that had never needed to be spoken aloud. And Ethan Cole, standing at the edge of it all, remained where he was, not following, not calling out, as the town behind him finally understood that what they had witnessed was not a man losing everything, but a man who had refused to sell the one thing they could never have paid for. The dust did not settle right away. It lingered in the air long after the riders had turned, drifting slowly across the street like a memory that refused to fade. The sound of hoofbeats softened with distance, each step carrying them farther from Dry Creek, until the rhythm that had filled the town was reduced to a faint echo against the open land. And then, even that was gone. What remained was silence. Not the uneasy quiet from before, but something deeper, something that pressed against the chest and made a man aware of his own breathing. Ethan Cole stood where he was, just off the main road, his back no longer to the town, but not fully turned toward it either. He did not follow the riders. He did not call out to Ayanna. He simply watched until the last outline of their figures dissolved into the horizon, until the line that had arrived with such quiet certainty disappeared as though it had never been there at all. Only then did he move. Not quickly, not with purpose anyone else could see. He took a single step forward, then another, continuing down the road that stretched beyond the town, his path unmarked, his pace unchanged. Behind him, Dry Creek remained frozen in place for a moment longer, as if waiting for someone to explain what had just happened. No one did. Sheriff Dunham lowered his hand fully from his belt, the motion slow, deliberate, as though he were placing something back where it belonged. His gaze shifted to the ground, to the contract lying in the dust where it had been dropped. The paper no longer held shape. The edges had curled inward, the red wax now a dull stain pressed into the dirt. He looked at it for a long moment, then looked away. There was nothing there to enforce, nothing there to hold. Wallace Grady still stood in the center of the street, the pouch of gold hanging at his side, heavier now than it had ever been. Not because of its weight, but because of what it could not do. His fingers loosened slightly, the leather sagging as the coins inside shifted without purpose. He glanced down at the contract, then toward the road where Ethan walked, then back again, as if trying to find the point where things had turned beyond his reach. There was no single moment, no clear line, just a quiet unraveling that had begun the instant Ethan chose not to take what was offered. The crowd began to move, but not all at once. A man near the saloon cleared his throat and stepped back, breaking the stillness. Another turned away, shaking his head slightly, though whether in disbelief or understanding, no one could tell. Boots shifted, doors creaked open and closed. The town resumed its motion, but it was not the same motion as before. Something had changed beneath it, something that could not be named, but could be felt in the way people avoided looking at the spot where the contract lay, in the way no one spoke about the gold that had not been taken. Ayanna did not return. Her place in the town remained empty, but it did not feel like absence. It felt like something had been reclaimed. The pendant she had worn lingered in memory, not as an object, but as a symbol of something the town had never fully understood until it was too late to measure it in terms they recognized. Ethan's figure grew smaller along the road, his outline softening against the distance. He did not look back. Not once. The wind picked up again, gentle this time, moving through the street, lifting small trails of dust that crossed over the contract and the footprints left behind by the riders. In time, those marks would fade. The paper would break apart. The road would look as it always had. But for those who had stood there, who had watched a man refuse something they believed no one would ever turn away from, the moment would not fade so easily. Sheriff Dunham remained where he was for a long time, his eyes fixed on the road, not following Ethan, but acknowledging the direction he had taken. Wallace Grady finally moved, bending down slowly to pick up the contract. The paper crumbled slightly in his hand, its edges no longer holding firm. He stared at it, then at the pouch of gold, and for the first time, neither seemed to hold any answer. He straightened, but did not speak. There was nothing left to say, and somewhere beyond the reach of Dry Creek, where the land opened wide and the horizon held no boundaries, Ethan Cole walked on, carrying nothing with him but the one thing the town had tried to buy and could never afford. Out here, it did not need a name. It did not need to be spoken. It only needed to be kept.